Good morning, welcome back. We are going further now into our study of apologetic method, and I told you last time we would begin this week studying presuppositionalism. And if you look at the first slide here, you see it's part one. As I was preparing for this, it became clear to me that I would need to do it in two parts, so that's what we're going to do. Now, I should start off by saying if you haven't had your coffee yet, then you might want to go ahead and pause and go get that now, because this is going to require harder thinking on your part. But I'm sure you can follow it and should benefit from it. I said last time that apologetic method, or the philosophy of how to go about proving Christianity, is a debate within the church, and the debate is between two sides, the traditional method and the presuppositional method. I won't go back over the traditional method in much detail today, other than to show you how a presup would respond to it. But if you haven't watched those prior videos, I would encourage you to do that. Okay, so I'm dividing this into 5 parts, I believe, and part 1 here is the question, are the traditional proofs even necessary? Are the traditional proofs, the argument in particular for the existence of God that we covered last week, are they even necessary? All right, so a presuppositionalist would say they're not, and in defense of this claim, he would have us think about the fact that there are really 2 different explanations for why you have people who would identify as atheists or agnostics, people who say they don't believe in God or they don't think you can know anything about God as creator. The 2 explanations would be either the problem is on the side of general revelation, that there's a failure of the creator to manifest himself in his creation, or the problem is on the side of man, and on his failure to rightly perceive or appreciate and respond to God's self-revelation in the world. So if you look at this diagram over here, you see God as creator, general revelation, that's GR there in the arrow, and then man in the circle. So the question is, where does the fault lie? Insofar as you have men who profess to be unbelieving atheists, agnostics, and so forth, is the cause of that the failure of general revelation, or is it something happening within them as the unbeliever? Your answer to those 2 questions gives 2 different conclusions. If the primary cause is not in man, as the secularists would say, then it must be on the side of God and general revelation. But if the primary cause is not on the side of general revelation, it must be on the side of man. And this is what the presuppositionalist says. He would cite, for example, Romans 1. We've read this before. I'll read it again, though, focusing on the parts that I've highlighted in yellow. Paul says, verse 8, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of people who suppress the truth in unrighteousness, because that which is known about God, as creator in the context here, is evident within them. For God made it evident to them. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, that is, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived, being understood by what has been made, so that they are without excuse." Now, the words I've highlighted here are emphasizing that as far as general revelation goes, as far as the world in which we live goes, it manifests the creator in a way that Paul says is evident, clearly perceived, clearly understood. So there appears to be no problem on the side of general revelation. The problem must therefore be on the side of man, and this seems to be what Paul is saying in the very same passage. Here I've highlighted with orange the key words. Verse 8, Paul says that men are suppressing the truth in unrighteousness. And the Greek word there for suppress means to hold down, to push down. And you could think of this as like taking a beach ball when you're at the beach or in a pool and you're trying to push it down into the water and it wants to keep coming back up. That's sort of an image of what Paul seems to be saying here about the knowledge of God in general revelation, that some people are trying to push it down, hold it down below their consciousness, and that they're doing that as an act of rebellion or defiance. It's sinful. It's unrighteous. Paul ends this passage here by saying that these people who are suppressing the truth are without excuse. And this means literally without an apologetic. That's the Greek word there, which is interesting. So that's a presuppositional view of the relationship between God and his revelation to man, and man as the recipient of it. So this means that a presuppositionalist would see the secular worldview or the secular mindset as a form of rationalization for sin. Rationalization is defined as a defense mechanism in which controversial behaviors or feelings are justified and explained in a seemingly rational or logical manner to avoid the true explanation, and are made consciously tolerable or even admirable and superior by plausible means. Here you see a picture of Richard Dawkins in his book, The God Delusion. And so from a presuppositional standpoint, that entire book is essentially one big, long effort of rationalization. Precepts will often use 2 Corinthians 10 as further support for this idea. You see here, Paul writes, "The weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty through God to the pulling down of strongholds, casting down speculations, and every high thing raised up against the knowledge of God, and bringing into captivity every thought to the obedience of Christ." Now, the idea here is that secular unbelief is like a defensive fortress that's being erected to block out or push out the knowledge of God, that the unbeliever doesn't want God in his head, in his heart, in his life. And so he's creating a philosophical fortress, as it were, to hide behind. And Paul is saying that we are going into the world to scale those walls, to undermine those strongholds, and to bring men to their senses, back into an admission or a confession of their sin before God. Presuppositionalists are also very big on emphasizing the nature of self-deception. In fact, Greg Bahnsen, who I mentioned last time, is probably the most important recent defender of presuppositionalism, wrote his PhD on self-deception at USC as a philosophy student, because he believed that this was absolutely crucial to making sense of the atheist, the agnostic. 1 John 1:8 says, "If we have no sin, we are deceiving ourselves." And that's an interesting claim, to deceive oneself. Usually, in the act of deception, you have two different people, one the deceiver, one the deceived. And the deceiver knows that what he's saying is false, but the deceived doesn't, and that's why he's deceived. He believes it. But in self-deception, the deceiver and the deceived are the same person, which is obviously a complicated psychological phenomenon, but a lot of philosophers believe it's a real phenomenon. Self-deception can be thought of as the somewhat, more or less, successful persuading of oneself of what one wants to believe in spite of the evidence. So in this case, there would be the evident fact, according to Romans 1, that men are sinners before a holy God. But most don't want this to be true. They want to hide this fact from themselves, and so they seek to deny it or explain it away. Now, some of these philosophers are actually really open about this fact. So here is a quote from Thomas Nagel, a very well-known atheist philosopher alive today. He says, quote, "I want atheism to be true. And I'm made uneasy by the fact that some of the most intelligent and well-informed people I know are religious believers. It isn't just that I don't believe in God and naturally hope that I'm right in my belief. It's that I hope there is no God. I don't want there to be a God. I don't want the universe to be like that." So you can at least admire this guy for his candidness here. All right, so again, to summarize, the precept would say that the theistic proofs of the classical apologists just aren't necessary, that God has made himself evident already to us in his creation, both in nature and within ourselves. In fact, John Calvin, who had a huge influence on the formation of presuppositional apologetics, said that to the pious mind, it might be said that nature is God. And what he meant by that was that the Creator is so thoroughly manifested in his creation, which he brought about, which he sustains and governs, that to be aware of the creation is to be aware of the Creator. And Calvin went on to say that these theistic proofs just aren't necessary. But we could also ask whether these classical theistic proofs are consistent with what Scripture says. And this is where a precept would say, no, they're not. He would say that the entire classical methodology sort of contradicts what Scripture says about general revelation and man's relationship to it. So here are some quotes from Aquinas. Recall last week when we talked about classical apologetics, I talked about the pre-modern version and used Thomas Aquinas as the example, and then the more modern version, and used William Lane Craig as the example. Well, Aquinas says very, very clearly that men, apart from these theistic proofs, do not know God as Creator. Look at this first line. He says, "It is an advantage for the truths of God, that is, as Creator, to be known by natural reason, to be proposed to men, to be believed on faith." What Aquinas is saying there is that though you can come to know that there is a Creator by means of these proofs, these sort of sophisticated philosophical proofs that we looked at last week, he said, or what he's saying here is that for most people, they can't perform those acts of reasoning. They can't get to those conclusions. We'll see why in a second. And as a result of that, for those people, the people who haven't worked through those proofs, the belief that there is a God must be just that, an act of belief, not knowledge. It's a matter of faith, not rational certainty. Okay, so he's saying that for the vast majority of people, they just don't know whether there is a God. If they believe it, it's believed on the basis of faith. He gives a variety of reasons for this. He says, if a truth of this nature were left to the sole inquiry of reason, three disadvantages would follow. One is that the knowledge of God would be confined to few. The discovery of truth is the fruit of studious inquiry. From this, very many are hindered. He says some are hindered by a constitutional unfitness, their natures being ill-disposed to the acquisition of knowledge. They could never, he says, by study to the highest grade of human knowledge. They could never arrive by study to the highest grade of human knowledge, which consists in the knowledge of God as Creator. And he goes on here. I'm putting these slides up with these lengthy quotes so that you can look at them on your own time. But for the sake of time, I won't read them all. But I've underlined the portions in these texts that make it very clear that for Aquinas, you cannot know that God exists unless you go through these proofs. And towards the end there, he says, thus, if the only way open to the knowledge of God as Creator were the way of reason, the human race would dwell long in thick darkness of ignorance. The knowledge of God as Creator would accrue only to a few, to the few that have the intellectual aptitude and the time and the training to actually understand those very complicated proofs. Now, following the Enlightenment, and I'll talk more about that momentarily, following the Enlightenment assault on classical theistic proofs like Thomas Aquinas's, modern classical apologists like William Lane Craig downgraded the force of these proofs from rational certainty to just probability. In this debate that Craig had with Hitchens, which I show my students here, he says at one point in response to Hitchens' claim that you can't know God with certainty, you can't know there's a creator with certainty, Craig responds, now Mr. Hitchens says, but you must prove this, God's existence, with certainty. And Craig says, not at all. I'm not claiming these arguments demonstrate Christian theism with certainty. I'm saying this is the best explanation of the data when you compare it with other competing hypotheses. I think it's more probable than not. Now, this makes the presuppositionalists very uncomfortable to speak about the knowledge of God as creator. Well, in fact, he doesn't even say it's a knowledge of God. It's a belief that's reasonable or probable. But to talk about our awareness of God in these terms as simply the best explanation or as a hypothesis that's more probable than not would suggest by implication that there are other reasonable, more or less reasonable explanations. Say atheism, or maybe pantheism or panentheism or deism. And to portray the claim that God exists as a hypothesis that's more probable than not would again seem to conflict with what Paul says in Romans 1. And interestingly, it's not something that Aquinas would say, right? Aquinas says that these proofs are certain. Either way, though, the point is that a presuppositionalist would disagree with the way that these pre-modern and modern classical apologists frame things. So contrary to Aquinas, academic arguments are not necessary to have genuine knowledge of God's existence as creator. And contrary to modern thinkers like Craig, man's knowledge of God as creator is not a matter of probability. The precept would insist that the evidence is undeniable and inescapable, such that people who claim to deny God's existence are either lying or self-deceived. That is to say, they believe it because they persuaded themselves that they believe it, even though in some sense they don't. They're in a state of cognitive dissonance. So in either case, though, they would be guilty of suppressing the truth in unrighteousness. So according to a precept, the classical apologist seems to be assuming sort of a secular view of the world, even in the process of arguing against it. You see here a picture of a man sitting on a tree branch, sawing off the branch on which he is sitting. And this is supposed to be sort of a picture of the inconsistency of the classical method, that they're sawing off the branch on which they are sitting by assuming the secular worldview that they're trying to refute. What do I mean by the secular stance or position? Well, here you have a list. These are more or less what the secular position assumes. That God as creator is not already sufficiently evident to all men apart from these proofs. That they are genuinely ignorant of the creator's existence, therefore, until those proofs are given. That this unbelief is the proper default position for all men, all rational people to have. And that they are therefore intellectually innocent until proven guilty by the apologist. There's also this assumption about their the condition of their heart, as it were, that they sincerely want the truth about God and are fully capable of an impartial and honest assessment of the evidence and ready and willing to believe if only we can give them good arguments. But again, from a presuppositional standpoint, that wouldn't be true either. Paul says they're in the business of suppressing the truth. They don't want the truth about God. They're warring against that. So this leads to part 3, that by trying to beat secularists at their own game, and according to their own secular rules of the game, the traditional apologist just cannot win the argument. This is what a precept would say. Of course, the classical apologist would disagree with this, but it's for you, the viewer, to think this debate through. Okay, I teach my students that he who defines wins. When you're debating, part of the debate is what you're debating. You're debating the nature of the debate. You're debating the terms of the debate, the standards for adjudicating the winner of the debate, the assumptions, and so forth. This is sometimes called framing a debate. Framing a debate is defining the nature of the disagreement in such a way as to bias the outcome ahead of time. It's like stacking a deck of cards. One author says this: it helps you strategically present issues in terms that help shape the debate in your favor. A way of controlling the ground that you fight on instead of debating or fighting a campaign on the opposition's terms. When you do that, you let them frame the debate instead of you, and it usually makes you look defensive. Well, the presuppositionalists say that the secular frame, which they would say the classical apologist is more or less assuming, is in fact functional atheism, and therefore it's stacking the deck ahead of time, playing with loaded dice, as it were. So remember, the secular frame which the classical apologist seems to accept is, first, that a classical linear proof purports to move from the known to the unknown. So you have to have this classical style proof. You're going from the known to the unknown. That must be followed. That principle or rule must be followed. And that, according to both secularists and classical apologists like Aquinas, man and nature are the known and God is the unknown. Okay, so far the secularists and the classical apologists are in agreement on these points. The job of the classical apologist then is to move us by means of these proofs to the knowledge of God. So the classical apologist is starting with the knowledge of man and of nature to get us to the knowledge of God by means of a logical, sophisticated proof from science, philosophy, and so forth. The secularist says this can't be done. The classical apologist says it can. But the presup would say this. He would say that this whole way of framing it means by implication that we are defining man and nature as well as knowledge before we know anything about God. Think about that. If we accept the secular classical framing, the idea is, in some sense, what we're assuming is that we are free to define the nature of reality, the nature of nature, the nature of man, the nature of knowledge, okay, the nature of what's possible and impossible, probable and improbable, and so forth and so on. We're defining all that stuff before we know anything about God, right? Because God's supposed to be the conclusion of all of the argumentation. Well, this in turn means, by implication, that we are starting our argument with what is effectively an atheistic starting point, where the sinful human mind is set up as the source and standard of truth and knowledge. Let me try to illustrate what a presuppositionalist is talking about here. So here you see the argument we looked at last time, the Kalam cosmological argument. I'm going to show you in the following slides how secularists respond to the first premise of this argument. The argument again is whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. Now when I go through this argument with my students, I ask them which of these two premises do you think is most obvious? And they would all say the first one, whatever begins to exist has a cause. And I have them think about, well, is it really obvious or not? And most of them would say, yeah, it's obvious. In fact, they would say it's self-evident. What's interesting, though, is that there are secular philosophers who deny this. And they're using their secular philosophy to deny it. Let me give you some examples here. So this is from Quentin Smith, a well-known atheist philosopher. And he says this, regarding the first premise here. What reason is there to believe this causal principle is true? It's not self-evident. Something is self-evident if and only if everyone who understands it automatically believes it. Many philosophers, scientists, and indeed the majority of graduate and undergraduate students I've had in my classes think this principle is false. This principle is not self-evident, nor can this principle be deduced from any self-evident proposition. Therefore, there's no reason to think it's true. It is either false or it has the status of a statement we do not know to be true or false. At the very least, it is clear that we do not know it is true. Okay, so you would think that if there was any premise that theistic proof would be, and that would be so clear, so obvious, it would be this one. In fact, in some places, Craig has said this probably shouldn't even be argued for because that would suggest that there's a principle that's clear than this one, that whatever begins to exist has a cause. But here's the thing, depending on your philosophy, you can challenge this first premise. Here's a picture of David Hume. I told you before that the Enlightenment philosophers attacked Thomas Aquinas' arguments, and that changed the way modern Christian apologists, traditional apologists, thought about classical proofs. They downgraded it to probability. One of the reasons is because of David Hume. David Hume was an empiricist, so he said all knowledge is, it begins with and ends in experience, all knowledge of real facts in the world, okay? So premise one here, according to empiricism, we can only know what we experience. Premise two, we have not experienced things beginning to exist. Remember the first premise of the Kalam argument. Whatever begins to exist has a cause for its existence, right? And Hume's saying, well, we've never experienced anything beginning to exist. We've only experienced things changing their states of existence. So you've experienced ice, for example, turning into water, or water turning into steam, but that's not something coming into existence. That's something that exists changing or undergoing a change or modification to its manner of existing. The conclusion then would be that even if the world began to exist, we cannot know anything about that fact since it exceeds our experience. I'm just pointing out here that Hume is starting with a theory of knowledge, a presupposition called empiricism, and then using that to resist the Kalam argument. He does it again here. He says, according to empiricism, the only kind of causes we know about are the ones we experience. Since we derive, he says, the concept of cause from experience. Say billiard balls bouncing around. Premise two, we have not and cannot experience a transcendent cause of the universe, which would be God. So the conclusion would be, therefore, even if the universe had a transcendent cause, we cannot know about it. Now, if you accept an empiricist view of knowledge, there's really no way around this conclusion. Now, Emmanuel Kant, this is a picture of Kant here, he challenged Hume. He accepted the force of Hume's criticism, but tried to get around them, and it's a very, very long, complicated story. But essentially, what Kant did is he revised the nature of knowledge, and he came up with what's called, in fact, they call it the Copernican revolution in philosophy, where Kant's theory of knowledge was erected to combat Hume's skepticism, but in the process, Kant actually blocked out a knowledge of God as well. And his argument was essentially that the human mind comes to experience with the structure of the mind imposing the idea of cause on the world. So it's not, the idea of cause is not something you get from the world, according to Kant. It's something you bring to sense experience. And his philosophy was that that concept of cause only applies to sense experience, which means then that it can't possibly apply to God because God's beyond sense experience. So on Kant's view, you can't actually talk about God being the cause of anything. It would just be an illicit claim. And notice how this leads, according to argument 2 here, this leads to what Kant calls a fallacy of equivocation. A fallacy of equivocation is when you switch the meaning of a term in the middle of an argument. So let's look at this argument. Premise 1, every event has a cause. Kant thinks that's true. Premise 2, the origin of the universe is an event. Okay, let's just say that's true. Conclusion, therefore, the origin of the universe has a cause. Well, that conclusion follows necessarily. But notice what I've done here. The first use of cause in the first premise is in yellow. The second use of cause in the conclusion is purple. Why? Because if you think carefully about it, those two different uses of the word are two different meanings. For Kant, the first use of the word cause is only referring to what he calls the phenomenal causes, the causes in the world, say of billiard balls bouncing around, or gravitational forces or something like that. But in the conclusion, the word cause there would refer to God as cause, as the transcendent cause of the origin of the universe. But that would be a different meaning of the word cause. That's called a noumenal meaning of cause. And so Kant would say that that's just a fallacy of equivocation. Here's an interesting quote from a contemporary thinker, and you see a picture of him here, who had a debate with William Lane Craig. I would encourage you to go and look at this debate. But I won't read this whole quote. I'll leave it up here for you to look at on your own time. But essentially what he says is that he doesn't share Craig's intuition that every event has to have a cause, or that, that something cannot come from nothing, okay? And the reason why I would encourage you to go watch this dialogue is because it's an hour-long debate over that claim, pretty much. And Craig, in the last analysis, essentially says, well, I think we just have to agree to disagree. I think it's obvious, you don't. And it's interesting because that's exactly what a presuppositionalist would say we should expect. They would say that what Craig's doing there is ultimately relying on a presupposition of his own. He's not proven this ultimate claim that something cannot come from nothing. He's just assuming it as true. He can't actually prove it. Now, you can go and listen to that debate and see if that's correct or not, but that's what a presup would say. Okay, so now we're going to go on to part 4, which is that secularists are reasoning presuppositionally, even if they and classical apologists don't realize it. Here is a picture of Richard Lewontin, an atheistic biologist, and he says very candidly, quote, "We secularists take the side of science in spite of the patent absurdity of some of its constructs, in spite of its failure to fulfill many of its extravagant promises of health and life, in spite of the tolerance of the scientific community for unsubstantiated just-so stories. Because we have a prior commitment, a commitment to materialism. It is not that the methods and institutions of science somehow compel us to accept a material explanation of the phenomenal world, but, on the contrary, that we are forced by an a priori adherence to material causes to create an apparatus of investigation and a set of concepts that produce material explanations, no matter how counterintuitive, no matter how mystifying to the uninitiated. Moreover, that materialism is absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot into the door." So this is really an admission on the part of Lewontin that he is, without even necessarily calling himself this or knowing this, that he's a presuppositionalist. He is using his ultimate philosophical commitments to control his arguments. That's exactly what a presupposition is. It's an ultimate philosophical commitment. As an ultimate philosophical commitment, it's partly a matter of the head, okay? A presupposition's a belief. As an ultimate philosophical commitment, though, it's also a matter of the heart. It's a part of your loves or your hates. It's a loyalty and allegiance. And as an ultimate philosophical commitment, a presupposition is the most firmly held belief within one's worldview. It's the most resistant to revision, the least negotiable, and the last belief to be given up in a debate. Presuppositions end up then being a person's supreme control beliefs. These are called control beliefs. What does this mean? Well, since presuppositions have the highest authority within one's worldview or network of beliefs, they serve to govern or police one's self-conscious belief formation. So when one's going about thinking through an issue, the presuppositions are going to be those fundamental beliefs that are controlling the process by which the person is sifting evidence, thinking about what's possible, impossible, probable, or improbable. They dictate what one takes to be real or reasonable or certain, or etc. They dictate which beliefs are allowed into one's system of thought. As we will see next, presuppositions exert the strongest logical force or pressure over one's reasoning. When it comes to debating, presuppositions determine the direction of inference. Now, I just want to pause here and point out that I think maybe this is the most important point for you to get to really understand this larger debate, okay? Presuppositions control the direction of inference. Let me explain this. Look at this statement. If miracles are impossible, then Jesus did not rise from the dead. Okay? That's called a sufficient conditional in logic. Now, logic does not tell us whether this statement is true or false. Okay? Logic tells us only two things. Logic tells us that if I affirm that first part about miracles being impossible, then I must affirm the second part, that Jesus did not rise from the dead. Or if I deny the second part, I must deny the first part. Okay? That's all logic tells me here. Logic says nothing, though, about what is possible or real or historical or truthful or anything like that. Okay? So the question is, what does? And the answer is your presuppositions. So look at this graph here. If you start out with a secular presupposition that miracles are impossible, well, then of course Jesus did not rise from the dead, right? That presupposition is dictating ahead of time what the outcome is going to be. But suppose instead I flip it. Suppose I flip the inference and I say as my presupposition that Jesus rose from the dead. Well, then the result would be miracles are possible, right? So the presupposition is what's controlling where you go in the argument. Another example. This statement, if purposeless evil exists, then God is not sovereign over evil. Okay, logic doesn't tell you what to affirm or what to deny. If you're a secularist, you're going to say, as your presupposition, purposeless evil does in fact exist. There's suffering that just has no purpose whatsoever. Therefore, God's not sovereign over that instance of suffering. Okay, that would follow logically. But if you're a committed Orthodox Christian, you'll say God's sovereign over all the specific instances of suffering in the world. It's His tapestry. He's weaving it all to His own glory and the good of His people, in which case you're going to conclude that purposeless evil does not exist. Now, who determines which of these inferences is correct? Well, they're both valid. They both follow logically from the premises. It's your presupposition that's going to ultimately determine the truth value of them. Now let's look at how secularists leverage their presuppositions against the classical arguments. So here you see the design argument. Premise 1, if design, then not Darwinism. Premise 2, design, conclusion, therefore not Darwinism. Okay, that's a valid argument. But if you're a secularist, you're just going to reverse this. Premise 1, if Darwinism, then no design. Premise 2, Darwinism. Conclusion, therefore, no design. Here are some quotes from atheist biologists. They would say, from Dawkins, biology is a study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. Notice that. He's saying the things look designed, but we know, presuppositionally, that they're not designed. They're materialistic. They are unguided, blind, random processes of matter and motion. That's his presupposition. Likewise, Francis Crick says, biologists must constantly keep in mind that what they see was not designed, but rather evolved. This is interesting. He's saying, it sure does look like it's designed, but we know, presuppositionally, that they're not designed. We can explain it materialistically is what they're saying. That's secular presuppositionalism at work there. So here's a picture I use in my class. This is a wood chipper. And you see the tree going in and being shredded up and turned into sawdust on the other side. The point is that presuppositions work like shredders. The classical arguments are going in like the tree, and they're getting shredded through the secular presuppositions of the opponent. That would be the idea here. And so this leads to the final point, that secular presuppositionalism can only be defeated by Christian presuppositionalism. I've said this word about 100 times now. My tongue's getting tied. All right, so here you see a clash between two worldviews, the Christian worldview and the secular or atheistic worldview. And the clash here is at the presuppositional level. Notice it's not a clash between belief and unbelief, but between antithetical systems of belief. The non-Christian rejects the Christian position on the basis of presuppositions of his own. He isn't a believer in Christ because he is a believer in something else, say materialism. The Christian, in turn, is an unbeliever with respect to that. Okay? So the conflict is between entire worldviews. I'm going to show you this one quote here from a man named James Orr. He's a Scottish theologian and intellectual from the late 19th century. The quote I'm about to show you comes from, I think, 1890. And James Orr is a pivotal transitional figure towards the development of presuppositional apologetics. What he was doing is recognizing that since the Enlightenment, since David Hume, since Emmanuel Kant and these other guys, a worldview shift had occurred that was making the Christian arguments, the classical or traditional arguments, seem less and less plausible. So here's what Orr says. No one, I think, whose eyes are open to the signs of the times, okay, so he's talking into the 19th century, can fail to perceive that if Christianity is to be effectually defended from the attacks made upon it, it is the comprehensive method which is rapidly becoming the more urgent. It is the comprehensive method, he means worldview apologetics. Worldview apologetics, which he says is rapidly becoming more urgent than the traditional method. The opposition which Christianity has to encounter is no longer confined to special doctrines or to points of supposed conflict with the natural sciences, for example, the relationship of Genesis and geology. It extends rather to the whole manner of conceiving of the world, of man's place in it, the manner of conceiving of the entire system of things, natural and moral, of which we form a part. This circumstance necessitates an equal extension of the line of defense. It is the Christian view of things in general which is attacked, and it is therefore by an exposition and vindication of the Christian view of things as a whole, as a system, that the attack can most successfully be met. This is the logic behind the work of the most important thinker on this, and that is Cornelius Van Til. This is my last slide here. Here you see a picture of Cornelius Van Til. He was a brilliant philosopher and theologian in the early part of the 20th century who was taking Orr's insight and the insight of others like Orr and reconfiguring the nature of apologetic argumentation. And he is arguably the most important architect of the presuppositional method. Notice his definition of apologetics here. He says it's the vindication of the Christian philosophy of life against the various forms of the non-Christian philosophy of life. In other words, he's taking a page out of Orr's book there. He's saying apologetics from now on must be proceeded from the standpoint of the entire Christian worldview as a system, to be defended as a system. Now, what does that mean? What does that look like? Well, that's going to be part two. That's going to be our next discussion. How does a presuppositionalist actually argue in a rational way with unbelievers? So we will proceed to that point next week. In the meantime, I would encourage you to go back over this and think carefully about the difference between presup and classical as I've laid it out today. And then you'll be better prepared to understand the presuppositional method next week. So, all right, well, thanks again for joining me. You take care.